3, 2, 1.
Hi guys, welcome to another virtual Lunch and Learn by Improving. We're giving everyone a few seconds to join here, but we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Kelly Tabler. I'm a principal consultant here at Improving. We're going to be talking about empathy and usability and how that factors in with writing ADA compliant code. So let's jump on into it. So what we're going to talk about today really focuses on three main sections. First, what is ADA compliance? We're going to define it for you, teach you about some of the overarching principles of it, then talk about how it factors into your design of a web application, and then your code of a web application. All of these are going to go hand in hand and help each other out to make your site compliant. So we're going to talk about each of those things. But first, anytime you talk about compliance, it really helps to have that empathy and know what this is really like to use the web as someone who has an impairment. So I'm going to show you an example of what that might look like. So I've got my browser here. I'm using a tool to pretend like I have a pretty severe visual impairment. Everything is blurry. This is Amazon. So I'm going to use a screen reader.
Less than style type equal quote text slash CSS quote link.
She's going to be talking to us. Sometimes she can get a little wordy. So we're going to navigate through the site, and let's say we want to buy a new Kindle Fire.
Header navigation. Open menu. Amazon. Link. Search. Alt. Search with hint.
Okay.
KINDLE space FIRE.
So we're going to
button.
Kindle Fire.
Amazon.com. Kindle Fire. All new Fire HD8 tablet.
Okay.
All new Fire HD8 tablet.
Maybe the
8
one
HD
I want
display.
because I've got, some visibility here. All right, it's taking me that.
Amazon.com. All new Fire HD8 tablet.
But I've got this
HD
image
display.
right here. I don't know what that says. I can't really read any text on that. So let's open
Enter
that
dialog. Immersive view dialog header. Close.
I'm going to try and navigate
Internal
through
link
this.
list item. Image.
It just says image.
List with 3 items. Image.
Doesn't tell me any of that text on there. I kind of don't know what I'm doing. I don't know any of that information. It might be something important to my purchasing decision. So we've got some issues just here with Amazon. And if I had let her talk even a little bit further, even the Amazon website will tell you for using a screen reader that it's better in the mobile experience. The desktop experience here is not very accessible. And there are little things like that you may never consider of the fact that this image has text in it and I can't know what it says with a screen reader. So little things like this can have a big impact on the usability of your sites and the accessibility of your sites for
Chromebooks is now inactive.
Users. So turned her off so she doesn't annoy us. And let's dive into how we can actually talk about some of this and start making sites a little more compliant. So starting with the basics of compliance. First question, does this apply to you? And the answer is always going to be yes. No matter what it is you're doing, your sites are gonna, any of your software is gonna have some sort of compliance at play here. It may be just a basic level of making sure that your site is navigable by a screen reader, or it may be something more complex in that you need to have sign language in your videos. That may vary, but some level of compliance should come into play no matter what you're doing. If it's user facing, you want to be considering accessibility. It's pretty much standard operating procedure now. It's no longer really optional. Part of that is depending on your industry. There have been some lawsuits in the housing industry that say you have an apartment rental website. The Fair Housing Act could say that if your site's not accessible, then you are discriminating against impaired users, and you may face some fair housing lawsuits there. So some other kind of famous suits in this arena. Winn-Dixie in 2017 was sued by someone because their website couldn't be navigated by a screen reader, and that user won. H&R Block was really one of the first ones that came out of this. There was a lawsuit that didn't go very far, but the Department of Justice kind of told H&R Block that they had to halt operations, and all of their mobile and desktop sites had to be navigable and made accessible before they could say that they could be used by any end users there. So this is still kind of an emerging realm in terms of what actually has to happen. The regulations are sometimes a little bit unclear as to what the penalties might be, but it is something that is happening more and more. So it's good to get ahead of that curve, start making things accessible. If you're starting from the ground up, it's a lot easier than trying to patch things on later after you've been caught or after you've been sued. So, and that's on top of, this is just a good business practice. Making your systems available to more users is good for business. And it doesn't have to be that hard or that complicated. Things to be aware of as you're starting this process, or even as you're in this process. Two main questions. Who's your compliance officer? So you should have someone in your organization that is making these determinations. A lot of times that might be a security officer or a CIO. It's often a dual role. So it's not someone's full-time job to determine what is or is not compliance. Sometimes they're also working with HIPAA regulations or PCI or any of those other types of compliance. You can work through all those together and they should be working on that. Second important factor here is, how are you testing this? I can walk through this with a screen reader. I can go and have my QA team build this into all of their testing practices. You can automate this testing. You can also have external auditors that will come in and help you and evaluate your site and tell you what is or isn't compliant. So being aware of how you're going to determine what your definition of done is there on compliance and accessibility. You want to be aware of that from the beginning. So we're going to move on to really what is ADA compliance at a super high level. So this law, Americans with Disability Act, basically says that users need, or any people need to have accommodations made for them so they can use the same services as other people. So that's really important. It's the same services. You can't build an entirely separate system for a visually impaired user to use or a deaf user to use and say that, okay, we're compliant because they have a separate system that they can do. That's not how it works. So it has to be the same thing. So when we're talking about that, what is an accommodation? That's a little bit in specific. How do I actually apply that and say that this is reasonable? It's a little bit easier physically if you say I have to build a ramp into my store, but when we're talking about the web, what does that really mean? So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, have come out with some high-level concepts of what you should and shouldn't be doing in order to make your sites accessible. It breaks it down into 4 main principles, and we're going to talk about each of those, but it's important to know that these principles aren't pick and choose. You can't have, one section of your site be compliant and another not. That means that you are just not compliant. You can't have closed captions in your videos but not be keyboard navigable and say, we're kind of compliant. That's just really not how it works. It's an all or nothing sort of concept. There's really no partially compliant designation here. So principle 1, content has to be perceivable. I like this example of we've all seen those bad lip reading videos and how you can reasonably interpret what someone is saying to be something that it completely isn't. So all of my content, say I have videos, closed captions, accurate closed captions is a great way of making that accessible to your deaf users. So alternatives of consuming this information, say I might want to, if I have a podcast, I want to make sure that I include a transcript. So a lot of that will work that way. Structuring your content similarly, you want to make sure that it is readable by accessibility tools, and that all plays into your structure. If I alter that based on an accessibility tool that I'm using, it can't stop making sense. if I zoom in on a page, I can't have my design just go completely out the window. I need to be considering the methods that people might be using to access my site. This also plays in at a fundamental level of color contrast. Say I've got my text up here, this white text on the green background. If I'd done a dark green text on that green background, that would be hard for a lot of people to see, much less people with visual impairments. So there's a lot of minimums and considerations that come into play there as we work through that. So principle number 2, your content must be operable. You'll hear about this a lot with keyboard navigation. What I've got behind me here is a carousel. You see these on a ton of sites. I've just got some hero images that slide through at the top of my page with announcements or just pretty pictures or anything like that. I took this from a Bootstrap example of how to use a Bootstrap carousel. So I've got 2 little arrows on either side here that a user can click through, or the slider labels at the bottom where I could click through those. So not just being able to tab through and hit enter, but as I tab through, announcing that something is a button or that this is a slider that's going to move on to the next image in my carousel. Helping that user understand the context of where they are is imperative to actually being able to operate your site. Principle 3 here is your content must be understandable. This seems pretty obvious, but it can be difficult at times with the nuances here. First, you need to make your content readable. Part of this is identifying what language your site is in. You can just put it in the header if your site is in English, lang equals EN, and that tells the screen reader, okay, I know what type of accent to use. I know how to interpret this. If I see a word I don't recognize, I might spell it out versus thinking it's in another language. If you've got a site in Spanish, you identify that. So that just helps the assistive technologies know what it is that they are reading. Second is, as part of this, is that your behavior of your site has to be predictable. If things pop up, say someone is working through a shopping cart and you want to show them a 15% off coupon, and you pop that up and say, enter your email and you can get 15% off. I want to announce that that came up and help the user understand that this has happened. And then the most obvious example of this is a form. If I've got an error in a form, this is a short, simple one that we've got up in the corner here, but say I've got a really long, 60 field form and I've got an error in the middle of it. I've forgotten a required field. I want to take the user to that error. I want to highlight it somehow, and I want to tell them what's wrong with it, that it's required and they didn't enter it, or they've got a phone number that's invalid. You want to tell the user what is wrong and help them fix it. You don't want to just say, oh, there's an error, good luck with that. So again, that factors into not just accessibility, but that's just good design. So all of this applies to your users no matter what their level is here. So principle 4 is that your site must be robust. And this is just a short way of saying that you should have proper structure and syntax in your site. Use the HTML that you should be using. If it's a header, use a header tag. If you're doing a table, use a table tag. All of this perhaps seems obvious, but sometimes when we're using certain tools or libraries, we work in a different way and we're like, as long as it looks fine to the user, it doesn't matter. But your assistive technology here doesn't actually see anything. It's just interpreting what your code says. So the assistive technology has to be able to interpret this correctly and understand your intent, not just what the end result is. So this is just structuring everything properly. And really, if you're using proper HTML, a lot of this compliance will really just come along with that. So now, how does this come into design? When we're talking about web design and accessibility, they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Just because a site is accessible doesn't mean that it has to have a boring design. Doesn't mean that it has to have a plain layout and, you know, not the cool new features. There are some fantastic looking websites out there that are completely accessible and completely compliant. So the important part to that is taking that into consideration when you're doing the design. Whenever possible, start with accessibility in mind as you're starting to design something, and it'll play into the entire rest of your design and development cycle so that it's just a normal part of a great design. So first, words and fonts matter. Your body text should be 16 pixels minimum whenever possible. You don't want people to have to zoom all of the time. Your standard formatting should be as readable as possible by an average user, and then people with impairments can modify it from there. Second is color contrast. As I talked about with, you have a green on green example that is pretty hard to read, but when you're talking about color contrast, keep your font size in mind there. Example here is bigger text can have less contrast. I can have a lighter gray on my white background if the text is bigger and bolder. If it's smaller and finer, I need to go with a higher contrast. I have to use a darker gray there to make that work and to make that readable. So you can see the difference between those two. Then labeling. Anytime you have an input field, you should have a label on it. A lot of times people will put placeholder text and use that as a label. So as soon as your cursor enters that, I no longer know what that field is supposed to be. If I have a cognitive impairment, or even if I just go in that field and walk away and come back, I may not know what that field needs anymore. So always use labels outside of your input fields. And then make your text understandable. Try and use the simplest language that you can that makes sense for the purpose of your site. Consider your audience when you are writing this text. If you have an audience of medical professionals, then yes, you can use medical terms. But if it is not an audience of medical professionals, I want to simplify that language so that it is understandable to the layman. Use proper grammar whenever possible. There's some room for style there, of course, but making it understandable is about making it simple, straightforward for your intended audience. Now, next, prepare your eyes a little bit. This is going to be a bit jarring. So, color is your frenemy. This is a real site, and I even put a dark gray overlay on it because it was just a little bit too blinding. You can go to lingscars.com and see this in reality for yourself. This is a prime example about how color can really be your enemy there. So when colors are bad, it's when they're too bright, when it looks like a circus on my page. I don't know where to look. I don't know where to click. I don't know what is important. I don't know what's not important. So this is kind of a prime example of not only poor design, though I suppose they get attention because if you just Google bad design, they come up there. So I guess there's some, no publicity is bad publicity. But this is a prime example of bad design and bad accessibility because this is just a really difficult site to use. But on the opposite of that, color can really be your friend. Use colors that are easy to see. You want to use proper contrast. The standard is a 4.5 to 1 of an element versus what it is against. There are color contrast checkers out there that will help you pick these palettes. We typically recommend that you use 3 colors in your palette and then 1 accent color. So you've got kind of 4 main colors on that site, and that helps keep things clean, helps keep things accessible, and a lot of times that goes with good-looking sites. Lastly, don't rely on color alone. So if color is the only indication of something, then that is by definition not accessible. So if I've got an indicator of validity of something or an error. If something is green for success and red for failure, if I'm red-green colorblind, I'll have no idea whether or not something succeeded or failed. Now it's going to go right into an example we've got here, quick and dirty, pretty simple sign-up form. I've got my name, my email, my password, and submission. For people who have no visual impairments, the form on the left here, totally fine. But if I've got some red-green color blindness, then all of those colors look exactly the same. So some ways to work around this is going to be, you notice the little icons on there that I've got check marks for things that are good and an X for something that's bad. So I've got a secondary indicator of something that is wrong. In addition, we're helping them solve that error by saying, enter in a valid email address. So they don't just think something is bad about that email, we're saying that that email address is invalid. So that allows for more users to be able to use this form in the same way. It's the same form, but it's got multiple indicators so that different types of users get the same information out of it. So all of that design, how does that play into actually writing compliant code? As I'm writing my HTML, as I'm writing my JavaScript, how do I actually make this compliant? How do I put that design into practice? So first thing you need is some tools. There are just a few that I've listed here that are useful and that I have used in the past. So if you're using OS X, iOS devices, there's VoiceOver that comes out of the box. You can just enable that in your settings on your phone, on your laptop. Similarly, in any Windows systems, there is the narrator. Android, I forgot the name of the Android one, but it also has a similar VoiceOver accessibility tool there so that you can just enable those out of the box. Now in the browser, you typically want to get a little more granular than some of these screen readers will do for you. So a lot of times that will be browser based. The one I use regularly is Chromebox because I use Chrome. So this is just an extension that you can add onto your browser. It's what I was using at the start here, and we'll also get into it with some examples, and it will read that out for you. And that's for any Chrome. Now for developers, if you're actually writing this code, there are a few more things that you might want to use. The Axe extension for Chrome is a checker. You can get it in the Chrome store, and it will help highlight, here's where you might not have some color contrast that you need to. Here's where you've got an image that we think has text in it that doesn't have any sort of alternate label. Here's where you've got a button that isn't keyboard accessible. It'll help flag some of those things for you. Beware as you're doing this, though, that just because that extension doesn't find any issues doesn't mean that you're compliant. So it's an assistant, not a auditor. Similarly, Wave, which works in both Chrome and Firefox, does something very similar where it will highlight any accessibility issues that it thinks you might have. And then Funkify, which is in Chrome, is an emulator for certain visual impairments. It also does some other impairments. It might we used it to blur out Amazon earlier, but you can also have it where it will simulate dyslexia by scrambling some of the words around, things like that. And it will really help you put yourself in the shoes of someone who is trying to use this site. You can use a screen reader all day while you can actually see the site and you're developing it, and you're like, of course, this totally works. But then as soon as you black out that screen, your own site that you've been working on, you have no idea how to get around it with a screen reader. So it can really help you put yourself in that spot and really try some of this out. So now that we've got our tools, let's start talking about the code itself. So basics, like we've talked about, make sure that any actionable item is navigable with the keyboard. So you'll see a lot of generated code, or some people with some bad habits. They'll put tab indexes on things and they'll say tab index 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the order in which you're supposed to get around the page. Don't do that. If it is accessible with a keyboard, it should always have a tab index of 0. And the order in which it is in your markup is the order in which it should be navigated. So this is about using that simple structure, using proper structure so that assistive technology can get around your site. if I want button B to go in front of button A, then I should switch the order in which they're in my DOM, and then it will be tabbed correctly. So if you're finding yourself putting a greater than 0 tab index on something, chances are you've just got something out of order. Similarly, use a tab index of -1 if something shouldn't be navigable. If I have a button that's disabled, then you put a -1 on that, and that means it just gets skipped over. So that one is totally fine, but otherwise you should be using 0. So next, use markup that makes sense. Talked about this a little bit before. If I have a table of data, I should probably use a table. I know those sometimes give people a little bit of an itch. They're like, no, I want to use divs as a table, but where you can, use the element that's intended for the content that you're trying to put out there. If you've got an ordered list of something, if I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 elements, then I want to use an ordered list. If I've got something that doesn't matter the order, I want to use an unordered list. I don't want to use an ordered list and then just change the style of the bullets. I want to actually use the markup that makes sense for my purpose. And then we want to structure our headings. So we touched on that briefly a few minutes ago with, I've got header 1, header 2, header 3, and I want to keep those in the proper order. I don't want to start with header 3 and then have a header 1 underneath it. That doesn't make sense. My page should really only have one H1 on there, and then everything else should fall underneath that, and keep that hierarchy in mind, because as I'm navigating around with the screen reader, that allows me to jump between sections. So I can say, okay, that first section I don't need, I'm going to jump to the next section and the next section. It gives you kind of a table of contents of what you're working through if you've got the proper headings in there. So then including the page language, you can always put that in your header, so then your screen reader will know what it is. Using titles is also important. Whenever I change pages, I click a link and switch to another page, then a screen reader will read out the title of the new page that I'm on. So that will help provide context, again, to the user so that they know where they are. They know that the page has changed and they know where they are now. So anytime you can help your user figure out where they are, you should, and titles are the first step in that. So then we talked about input fields having a label. Quick and dirty example here with just standard HTML, standard proper formatting that a lot of times we forget about. So I've got a first and last name text field and then label for them. And I can say this label for first name, it's associating that with the first name input. So anytime I am using a screen reader or moving things around, it knows to associate these things with each other. So it knows what to read and what is what. It helps you with error identification. It helps you announce where a cursor might be. All of that, just associating these things together is really helpful. So some basic stuff you can do there. Now, what if you've got a responsive site, which you likely do, or you're using a tool, say you're using Bootstrap or Material or something like that, where you don't necessarily have the same control. I'm using a library that builds my tables for me, and it's going to build them in divs because that's really popular. That's totally fine. You can't always use what would be considered the proper markup for lots of reasons. And when that happens, we've got something that can help us. So ARIA comes to our rescue. So the Web Accessibility Initiative has these roles, states, properties that you can use within your HTML that will help with any sort of accessibility. And this is pretty standard across all browsers, especially for the last 10 years or so, they've really adopted this. So what works in Edge is likely going to work in Chrome. They all have little nuances between screen readers and whatever assistive technology. But if you're using the proper stuff here, then you are most likely going to be readable by any sort of assistive technology. So first is going to be your roles. So we've got an example here of a role of a scroll bar, or I might have a role of a table. So I've got a div that is acting as a table, and I just say the role is table, so that when I am using my assistive technology, it knows that I have entered into a table, and it can talk about headers and columns and help people navigate what that is through the screen reader itself. A really common usage is that I got a link that is styled as a button. I want to say that the role of that link is a button, so that as I tab through that, I know that I've got a submit button, not a submit link, because that might confuse me as to where it's taking me. So I can say that the role is button, so it can say button submit, and it can read all of that out, and it tells your assistive technology, I know that it is a div, but really it's a table. So it helps the interpretation there really work through that. Second is going to be your states. So we've got a couple here that there's an ARIA hidden. So we say that this isn't actually visible to the user, so don't read it, because it's in my DOM, a screen reader is going to see that, and as I navigate through, it might read out sales targets, and I don't actually want it to read that. I want to say that this isn't visible. So it says, this is hidden, don't worry about it. That might be for a tab. Say I've got a couple of tabs on a page, got all my tab content on there, but 5 out of my 6 tabs are hidden. I want to say, don't read these because they're not visible to the user. Similarly with tabs, I have one selected, so I would say that the ARIA selected is true of that tab that is selected, and the others would be false. So it just provides that contextual information to your user so that they know what is happening, where they are, any sort of context that they need. So this is really kind of the foundation of why design doesn't have to be sacrificed for accessibility, because I can make cool designs and use things like your ARIA tags in order to make that design accessible. I can always build on top of that. For the, a cool slider that I want to do, I can use ARIA to indicate where things are, to announce when a pop-up has come up, so that I can work around that and make my design accessible as well. So moving on next, talked about a lot of this. Let's actually kind of see it in action. And we're going to turn this on with a screen reader. Just got a code pen here.
Text area.
I'm going to turn my screen reader back on.
Data compliance, states and roles.
So we've got here
Heading 1.
some tabs.
Data compliance, states and roles. Heading 1.
Some headers. You see she said heading 1.
Tabs, roles, and states. Heading 2.
The heading 2 here. Now I'm going to navigate on to my tabs.
Tab list with 3 items. Tab 1. Tab selected 1 of 3 list item.
So you can see, not only did it tell me there are 3 tabs that I can go through, but it also says tab 1 is what's selected. So now I want to see what's next. I want to select tab 2.
Tab 2. Tab not selected 2 of 3 list item.
So it says not selected.
Selected 2 of 3.
But now I can select that. So if I go then on down to
tab 3.
Content.
Tab 3. Tab 2 tab panel.
It even says, so it says tab 2 tab panel. So it knows, because it is a tab panel, that it's associated with tab 2. So it's giving me that context beyond just reading what's on the page. So let's look at what that code actually looks like. And I'll turn her off. So
Chrome box is now inactive.
I've got my tab here. This is just a Bootstrap tab example. Nothing complex. We're just using the out-of-the-box Bootstrap JavaScript. We didn't write any of our own JavaScript. We're just using that here within the HTML. That's all we've written here. So we've said that this role of this unordered list is a tab list. So now when the screen reader knows, when I go to this section, that I've got a tab list, and it just knows that I've got 3 tabs based on how many elements that I have here. Goes through and figures that out. I didn't have to say tab list has 3 items. I just said this is a tab list, and it was able to interpret that there were 3 items there based on what I've got here. So in my actual link on these tabs here is tab 1. So I said that the role is a tab, so that she knows this is a tab list item. I can say 1 of 3. And then I'm saying ARIA controls, tab 1 content. So that's that association, similar to what I have for labels, where I could say that this label applies to this input field. I'm saying that this tab controls my tab 1 content, which is right here. So it helps you identify what is associated with what, so that it knows what to read at what time. And then lastly here, you'll see this ARIA selected is true. So when I first start this page, it knows that my first tab is selected and the screen reader knows that as well. So if I look here, let's inspect this, you'll see that ARIA selected is true on tab 2. If I look at tab 1, it now says false. I'm going to select tab 1 back again. Now tab 1 says ARIA selected is true and tab 2 says ARIA selected is false. Bootstrap is doing this for us. We didn't have to write any of that to do it. So a lot of these tools that are out there are built with accessibility in mind. So if you're using a library like Bootstrap or Material or many of the others out there, if you're using their kind of standard stuff, they will help you with this accessibility as long as you're putting some of that foundation in place. If you're using the right roles, the right tags, the right everything, it will help you with that accessibility and try and do it for you. So that tells you each of those items. So if we keep scrolling here, we've also got some forms.
ADA compliance, tab 1 tab panel. Please enter your email address here with hint enter email.
So
edit text.
She said, please enter your email address here. So if I look here, let's go down a little bit. So I've actually said I've got an ARIA label, which means when you tab to this, read this text, please enter your email address here.
Text area.
Say something else here. Oops.
Please enter your email address here, quote placeholder equal quote enter email quote greater than A, E, hi, G.
Okay, so we're gonna refresh that now.
Read something with hint enter email.
She said,
edit text, edit text.
See, she just said read something. So it's whatever I put in that label is what she's going to read, regardless of what's on the visible page. So if you want to have some extra hints to people who might be using screen readers, ARIA label is a great way of doing that, of providing that information. I've also got some other things like a checkbox that I might use.
Password with hint password. Check me out. Checkbox not checked.
So she says checkbox not checked. So she knows based on her state.
Checked. Check me out. Checkbox checked.
So now she can say checkbox is checked. And then lastly,
submit button.
I've got a submit button. If I could also have that be a link with a row of button that she would also say that it was a button, even though it would normally say a link. So just some good, simple stuff that happens there. Now, also, one of the hardest things to navigate through if you're using a screen reader, because there can be so much tabbing, is navigation, right? So
submit heading 2, navigation, nav bar, internal link.
So she said navigation because if I scroll through all of this, we've actually used the nav element here. So she knows that this is navigation. So it provides that context to the screen reader. So I know, okay, now I'm in some sort of navigation menu.
List with 3 items. Home, current, internal link list item.
So I know that the home link is my current link, that I have 3 more to go through.
Link, internal link list item, drop down, expanded.
So that one, you'll notice she said expanded because I hit enter.
Collapsed, expanded. Collapsed.
So as I go through, and
expanded.
I'm just doing this with my keyboard, not with my mouse. So she knows whether that drop down or a pop-up is expanded or collapsed, so that I know if I'm going through this,
action,
what my
internal
context is, so that I can know, okay, I haven't moved beyond that drop down because I'm in an expanded state. I'm going to be working through that before I move on to something else. So
another action, something else here. Search with hint search. Edit text. Search entry.
Going through those to just provide all of that context that you need.
Chrome Vox is now inactive.
So turned her off because she can be a bit noisy sometimes when I'm trying to talk. So if we look at all of this here, we've got some ARIA expanded, and we start with false. So we know that it is collapsed. And then when we do expand that, so you can see ARIA expanded is false. When I have expanded that, you're going to see that the ARIA expanded is true. So again, this is just some Bootstrap that is doing this for us, setting in that expanded is false and true. Now, if you're rolling your own, if you're not using one of those libraries, you do need to write your own JavaScript to do this, to set those attributes so that it is done properly, because just by the factor of me clicking on it doesn't mean that this automatically changes without using one of those libraries. So if I just, only have HTML and I'm not using any, sort of JavaScript there, then it's going to keep saying ARIA expanded is true even when it's collapsed if I don't actually change that. And that is even more confusing to your user because you're saying that it's expanded, but it's not. So you want to be really cautious as you use any of these. Use those frameworks that are out there to do a lot of this for you. And if not, make sure that you do roll your own and that you don't leave that out. So just some good stuff to know there. All right, I'm going to switch back here. Now, just to recap a lot of what we've talked about, you have kind of a standard checklist as you go through and try and make your sites accessible. First, and perhaps most important, is that everything should be keyboard navigable. This is useful to any user, really. How many times have you filled out a form online and you don't want to click from form item to form item? You want to just go through quickly on your keyboard, tab between it, and work with that. So if it's properly keyboard navigable, if it's not jumping all over the place, that's just good usability on top of being accessible. Make sure that your site makes sense with a screen reader. Just add on the little browser extension, see what it's like to use your site, see what's confusing, see what works, see what you need to improve. Just playing around, doing some exploratory testing with a screen reader on your site is going to get you a long way towards better usability here. Then, of course, having that minimum text to background color ratio, really, really important there. Again, that's part of just good design, not just accessible design. Anytime you've got some, dark text on slightly darker text, that's pretty hard to read. Having your logical page structure, using markup that makes sense. Use your roles and names whenever applicable. It doesn't take a lot to just toss a, ARIA label onto a form field or a button. It doesn't mean that you need to rewrite your entire system. If you're using something like React or Angular or any front-end framework, it's built into those as well. So even if you're not writing vanilla HTML, you have access to a lot of these through a lot of those frameworks, so you can absolutely use them. Finally, tell the user what's happening. So if I have a timer on my page that all of a sudden, hot new deal, don't forget, buy this now. You've got an Amazon limited time deal with 10 minutes left. Announce that to your user. Don't take them somewhere without telling them that you're taking them somewhere. Don't change something on the page without telling them that something is changing on the page, because a lot of times that's just not something that anyone is going to notice. So you want to tell your user what's happening. And as we've talked about all of this, you're wondering, how far do you go? I'd say there's no partially accessible, but there are levels to whether your site is ADA compliant. The first level here is just your level A compliance. This is basic stuff like color contrast, keyboard navigation, everything we've talked about above this. That is what ideally every site out there should have. The next level, if you want to go a little bit further, is going to be your AA intermediate compliance. So that builds on top of level A, and then it adds things like your video captions, like the ability to zoom in on portions of the page without things going crazy, and then focus visibility. So you notice as I was using the screen reader, it had a little orange highlight that was going through. But if I'm not using a screen reader, if I'm just tabbing through, sometimes it can be hard to see what's actually focused. Some browsers will do that by default now, but you can turn it off. Maybe on your page, you don't want to turn that off. You want to, highlight a button if it is focused so that a user can see what is focused at any given time. And that's going to be part of the AA compliance. Now the AAA compliance, that is advanced. That is not commonly something that you're going to need to do depending on your audience. Typically, this is when you are specifically targeting a group that needs some form of accessibility. And that is when you're going to want to have things like multiple presentation options, that being not only do I have captions in my video, but I also have sign language. So it's going that extra step further. And it also includes error prevention. So not just assisting people with finding errors once they happen, but actually actively preventing usage, entry errors, things like that. And then having no timers on your page whatsoever. So nothing that happens automatically. You know, removal of all of that is going to be part of that AAA compliance. So as we start to wrap things up, we are going to ask for questions. So please go ahead and start entering those into the Q&A chat here. But I've got this massive slide. You don't have to remember all of this. Take a screenshot if you want, duck out of the way. But all of these tools are really useful. The standards, the screen readers that you might use, accessibility checkers, design tools. I found this incredibly useful. Anytime you're just pulling out a new design, there are some compliant sites. Colorsafe.co will suggest compliant color palettes for you. If you say, I want my primary color to be this shade of blue, it will suggest contrasting colors that will be compliant and that are, you know, some level of attractiveness. There are also just some color checkers that say, okay, I want this color gray text. Is that going to be okay on this color blue background? And it will help, you know, do that little math for you so that you can check that. And then the add-ons. You know, anytime you can check the color blindness, anytime you can inspect, anytime you can try maybe something with tunnel vision or something like that to actually put yourself in the shoes of someone who might be using your site. It'll just go a long way in the empathy towards your end user. So finally, I think we've got some about 13 minutes here for some questions. So looking forward to hearing if you guys have any.
We do have a decent amount of questions.
Great.
So the first one is, are people with disabilities consulted enough throughout the process since they are the end user?
That's a fantastic question. I think the obvious answer is probably no. The idea is hopefully that we do have users with disabilities who are part of building these tools, part of building these guidelines. But as with, I think, any development, having those target users and having a diverse audience as part of your user testing, whether that's your user acceptance or your design testing or stakeholder testing, anytime you can bring that in, I think that is important and should certainly be a factor. But I think, of course, it's probably not as common as it should be.
All right. The next one says, while there are many UX value add capabilities that only benefit non-impaired users, are there any such UI utilities or capabilities that can assist specifically impaired users that might not add any value to the other group? Should we use those? Should we avoid using those?
So I think a lot of that comes with some of the tools that will assist your assistive technology, like, you know, our labels, or there's a ARIA live announcement that will, you know, when you've got a pop-up say, hey, draw your attention here, and it draws your attention even more than it might for someone who's not using a screen reader. You know, say you've got that pop-up sale that's happening, that if someone's using a screen reader, their attention is going to be drawn immediately to it. Well, if you've got another user, they probably are going to scroll past it and never notice that thing changed up there. So there's some things like that, but in terms of actual design, I don't know, it's a good question. I'm sure there are some out there, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
All right. The next one says, if you need to support down-level browsers which do not support some accessibility features, how good are the polyfills at filling that gap? Is there any benefit to handling JavaScript events that are specific to a particular device category, for an example, touch events?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so, you know, if we're talking about older browsers and things like that, that's not something you need to worry too much about because this has been around long enough. But if you're talking different devices, A tablet versus a phone, there are absolutely different considerations that you have to make. Your touch events, your drag events, that might be different with a finger, a touch end, touch stop, and those should be a part of any consideration. But those are typically a part of any consideration you make in general design anyways. The additional level that you might need for accessibility might be in ignoring some of those events. If I know that a screen reader is in use, I may want to ignore some touch events because I know that they might be accidental. So there are some considerations to make there, and that's where really user testing will come in, as I think our first question alluded to. That's where you want to know your target audience and work with them through that. But these accessibility tools will work as well with touch as they will with a standard web browser. And it's actually a great exercise to do these on a mobile device as well. I know when I've been working on some of these sites, there have been a few times when using the voiceover on iOS, I could not get things to work. There was a drop down example. I could not get it to select an item in a drop down, and it was just so incredibly frustrating, and you end up having to work around that a lot. And some of that is just going to be on a case-by-case basis of, in this context, this type of device interprets this a certain way. And there's not enough of a standard between how these devices interpret things to get too exact with that. And so some of it is just that exploratory testing.
Okay. The next question is about CI/CD pipelines and if any of these tools can be integrated into those builds to pass or fail.
There are some of these accessibility checkers, the automated ones that will, scan through a rendered website and say you've got some missing areas of color contrast or you've got some inaccessible things. Those can absolutely be run through a CI/CD pipeline because you can spin up a headless browser and run that checker and have some output. So you can say if I've introduced a new image with text in it that my pipeline would fail and I would never allow that to go to production. So you can get some of that in. There are some other deeper automated browser tools, testing tools that will allow you to do that. I think Catalan is a common one out there that will do some of this. To be honest, I haven't played with that much in that area, but similar to other automated browser tools or automated testing tools, there are definitely some out there that will help. Now, using the screen reader itself, checking the auditory output and making sure that that is working on your site, that's something that I'm not aware of is possible yet, but some of these automated checkers are definitely out there. I would caution though that as with any automated testing, you don't want that to be your only testing. I think exploratory user testing is always really important, and I think it becomes even more important with accessibility because some of this nuance isn't always interpretable by automated tools. But there should always be a baseline smoke test of your accessibility there. It's a great question.
All right. The next one says, with CSS grid, the layout of the DOM can be order independent and the presentation can be arranged for different media breakpoints using grid areas. Do we know how that affects assistive devices and the ability to tab through the page?
It absolutely does, and it makes it wrong. We've played with this before with some that will, render things from right to left or bottom to top. And it will make the tab order incorrect. Your tab order will go from bottom to top rather than top to bottom. So that is something that I would consider that the CSS grid is actually not an accessible design. The way that you could work around that would be by committing the sin of adding tab indexes. That's not something that I would do. I would rather use another way of using that CSS grid because I think that is something that it as a tool needs to work better so that it can actually alter your DOM through the CSS because it is not an accessible design.
All right. If we build with accessibility first in mind, are there advantages or disadvantages to using the ARIA state in conjunction with framework events or state changes?
Yeah, a lot of times the frameworks that you use will do those ARIA states for you of selected, not selected, all of that. So it is using those and starting with your accessibility in mind from the very beginning means that you don't have to add these on later. But anytime you're doing a tab, even the tab example is the easy one of even if I'm starting with accessibility in mind, I still need to use those selected events and indicate those or not. So building with accessibility in mind doesn't mean that you don't need to use ARIA. ARIA is always going to be an additional tool that you can use. A lot of times, if you look at the examples on these sites, like I'm pretty sure I copy pasted that tab example from Bootstrap themselves, and they include those ARIA states in there because it should be a part of just your normal HTML development, regardless of when you started with accessibility, before design phase or after design phase or 10 years after the site has been live. Anytime you can add those, it's just a lot easier to add them in the beginning because you're building it with that in mind. You don't have to necessarily, pop some JavaScript on after the fact and do some hacky things that you don't love.
Yeah, kind of a follow-up question to that is, are there any accessibility-only JavaScript libraries available that would help or make it easier to use?
A lot of times it's already built into your frameworks. Angular's got some built in. Bootstrap, I keep going to, Material has them all built in. It's going to be along with whatever widgets it is that you are using because it's so widget specific. If I've got a map tab that's going to be interpreted completely different than just a div somewhere. So it's going to be so specific. There are some just good resources out there. The A11Y will have a lot of examples out there that you can use. But as far as I know, there aren't any just add-on frameworks that you can pop on there and use some of those. It's going to be finding what works for your specific scenario.
All right. You mentioned earlier that passing the accessibility checker doesn't necessarily mean that your site is PCI compliant. Mm-hmm. Do you know any tools that check if your site is PCI compliant, or how does one know that your site is actually compliant?
So I think we're probably talking about ADA compliance there versus PCI compliance, because I don't know too much about PCI compliance, so don't hold me to anything there. But so those tools will be a great indicator of if your site is not ADA compliant. But in terms of confirming that something is compliant, that's when an auditor will come in. There are lots of them out there. Some will do some basic level for free. Most you have to at least pay a certain amount for, and they will take your site, run their tools on it, run some human auditing through it. So that is really the way to validate that you are accessible. So there's no government entity or organization that really stamps a badge on there that says that you are compliant. It's going to be finding some independent auditors, and they should be independent. You shouldn't have a team within your organization saying yes, we are compliant. You should always go with some independence there. So these tools are just a help.
All right, and we're kind of getting close to the end, so I'll give you one more question.
Okay.
If there's no compliance pressure, what are some strategies to convince your company or client at that time that they should spend some investment into accessibility?
That is always one of the hardest things, right? Because people aren't always necessarily seeing an immediate return on that. The biggest way I can see is two methods. One is appealing to human empathy, of finding your users. You probably have many within your organization who have at least some level of color blindness, finding areas that they can't use and using that as a stepping stone. Second is the threat of lawsuits. Some of the examples that we started at the beginning, there is that pressure of it's going to cost you down the line. It may not cost you today, but if we can spend, some amount of money on our development time doing this now, it could save us $1 million of a lawsuit later. So that's usually the biggest thing, is the potential of a lawsuit. Also, if you are working with many governments, say, in improving, we have some tools that we use that are used by state governments, and they actually tell us that we need to be Section 508 compliant because that is a government site and they are actually required to be that. And then, because we work with them, there are some other things that we have to be compliant about. So sometimes that pressure can come from your customers or your clients themselves. So amplifying that wherever you can is usually a big win. Okay. I think that was our last question. So thank you everyone for joining us. We're right at 2 o'clock here. So definitely appreciate your time. Just wanted to tease next Wednesday on the 19th. Robin Fuentes is going to be talking about trust in Scrum teams. So be sure to sign up and join us for that one. Thank you, everyone.